Welcome back to Doc Fat's channel. Today, we're going to dive deep into the International Olympic Committee's, everyone just calls them the IOC, their latest position on transgender and athlete with sex variations, participation in elite sports, specifically their framework on fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination. This is big news for all of you out there, athletes, sports medicine folks, coaches. Even if you're just a fan, this stuff matters.
It really does. This framework, which came out in November 2021, is tackling a constantly moving target. How do we make elite sports fair when it comes to gender identity and sex variations? There are no easy answers, but the IOC is trying to guide the way forward.
Okay, so right off the bat, one thing that jumped out at me is how this isn't some one-size-fits-all rule book. They're actually saying, hey, individual sports, you figure out what works best for you.
That's a huge change. The IOC is acknowledging that different sports have completely different demands. What matters for fairness in, say, weightlifting versus badminton is probably not going to be the same. So instead of mandating one set of rules, they're giving individual sports federations, those are the IFs, the power to create their own policies.
So it's more like the IOC is setting the guiding principles. And then each sport has to figure out how to make those principles work in their own arena.
Exactly. And the really interesting part is that they're emphasizing three core values at the same time: fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination. That's a tough balancing act.
No kidding. It feels like for so long, the conversation has been stuck in this either-or mindset. Either we protect fairness or we promote inclusion. But this framework is saying, no, we need both.
And that's where things get really interesting. They're not shying away from the unfair advantage debate, but they're saying, hold on, you need to prove that advantage exists, not just assume it. They're pushing for decisions to be based on solid, peer-reviewed research, not speculation or stereotypes.
So instead of just saying, okay, all transgender women have an advantage because of X, they're saying, show me the data that proves this advantage actually exists. And show me that it's specific to this sport and this level of competition.
That's the key. It's about looking at evidence that's directly relevant to the athlete group in question. You can't just take data from studies on, say, cisgender men and apply it to trans women and say, see, case closed.
This emphasis on evidence really resonated with me. It feels like they're trying to move the conversation away from opinion and towards scientific data, which is crucial for making fair and informed decisions.
Absolutely. And they're also making it clear that no athlete should ever be pressured into undergoing medically unnecessary procedures just to compete. That's a huge ethical consideration that has frankly been overlooked in the past.
You're right. It's saying that an athlete's physical and mental well-being should always come first. We can't be asking people to compromise their health just to fit into some arbitrary category or rule.
It's a strong statement about respecting athletes' rights and dignity, which should be the foundation of any policy right.
Absolutely. Now, another piece that I found really intriguing was this focus on both transparency and privacy.
It's a tricky balance, isn't it? On the one hand, the IOC is saying that IFs need to be transparent about how they develop their policies, so everyone can see how decisions are being made. That's important for accountability. But on the other hand, they're also saying, hey, we need to protect athletes' privacy, especially when we're dealing with such sensitive information.
It's a tightrope walk for sure. And I know a lot of people are going to be watching closely to see how IFs navigate these complexities.
Me too. And speaking of navigating complexities, the framework even provides some real-world examples of how these principles might be put into practice. One that stands out is the Australian Football League, the AFL. They've already developed a sport-specific policy that goes way beyond just looking at testosterone levels.
Okay, so tell me more about that. What does the AFL's approach look like?
They're considering a whole range of performance factors, things like height, weight, strength, even game-specific data like sprint times and GPS tracking. It's a much more nuanced and individualized way of assessing potential advantages.
It sounds like they're really trying to move away from these simplistic binary approaches to something much more data-driven and tailored to the specific demands of their sport. I imagine that's going to require a lot of expertise from sports medicine professionals, right?
Absolutely. We're going to be key players in helping to gather and interpret this data, ensuring that decisions are made in a way that's both fair and scientifically sound.
Which is exactly where you come in. I bet you're already thinking about how this framework might impact your work with athletes.
Oh, definitely. And I'm curious to hear what our listeners think too, especially those of you in the sports medicine world. This is going to affect all of us.
It's a big conversation, and we're just getting started. But before we dive into the 10 principles themselves, I think it's worth taking a step back and acknowledging just how challenging this issue is. The IOC is trying to balance a lot of competing interests and values here.
You're right, and we're going to see a lot of debate and discussion as IOFs try to put these principles into practice. This is definitely a story to follow closely.
Agreed. Okay, so let's unpack those 10 principles. The first one is all about inclusion. It basically says that everyone, regardless of their gender identity or sex variations, should have the right to participate in sport at all levels, and to do so safely and without facing prejudice.
It's a fundamental right, and it's really about fostering a welcoming and inclusive environment from the ground up. We're talking about taking concrete steps to prevent harassment and abuse, recognizing the vulnerabilities that trans people and people with sex variations often face.
This seems especially important in the context of sports, where there's so much emphasis on physicality and competition. We need to be extra careful to create a culture of respect and understanding, where all athletes feel safe and supported no matter who they are.
Couldn't agree more. And that leads us to the second principle, which focuses on preventing harm. This is all about prioritizing the physical, psychological, and mental well-being of athletes when we're setting up rules about who can compete.
It's a really important reminder that these aren't just abstract policies. They have real-world consequences for real people. Decisions about eligibility can impact an athlete's health, their career, even their social standing. We can't take that lightly.
Exactly. And the framework even suggests that some IMFs might decide that the potential harms of having certain eligibility criteria actually outweigh any benefits. In those cases, they might choose to prioritize inclusion over restriction.
That's a powerful statement. It's basically saying, hey, sometimes the best way to protect athletes is to just let them compete.
And to constantly be assessing and mitigating any potential negative impacts. It's not enough to just set the rules and walk away. We need to be constantly monitoring how those rules are affecting athletes and be willing to make adjustments as needed.
It's about being proactive and compassionate, not just reactive.
Mm.
Okay, so principle number 3 tackles non-discrimination head on.
Yes, this one emphasizes that eligibility criteria should be developed and implemented fairly, without systematically excluding athletes based on their gender identity, physical appearance, or sex variations.
So no more saying, okay, if you're a trans woman, you automatically can't compete.
Right. Instead, they're saying athletes should be allowed to compete in the category that aligns with their self-determined gender identity, as long as they meet any other relevant criteria that are consistent with the framework.
That recognition of self-determined gender identity is huge, isn't it?
It really is. It aligns with international human rights standards and emphasizes the right to autonomy, the right to define your own identity. And it directly prohibits practices like sex testing or gender verification, recognizing that those are often harmful, unreliable, and frankly, dehumanizing.
It's about challenging those discriminatory assumptions and saying we're not going to police people's bodies or identities.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing the diversity and complexity of human biology. We can't force everyone into neat little boxes.
This principle really feels like a fundamental shift towards a more inclusive and equitable approach, one that respects the rights and dignity of all athletes.
It is. And it recognizes that trans athletes and athletes with sex variations are distinct groups, each with their own unique needs and experiences. We can't lump everyone together.
It's about moving away from those one-size-fits-all approaches and saying, hey, let's acknowledge the individual and find solutions that work for them.
Which, as you can imagine, is not always easy. But it's the direction we need to be moving in if we want to create a sporting landscape that's truly fair and welcoming for everyone.
This is all so fascinating, and I'm eager to hear more. But I know our listeners are busy people. We're going to take a quick pause here, but don't go anywhere. When we come back, we'll dive into the remaining principles and unpack what they mean for the future of competitive sports. This conversation is just getting started.
All right, so we've talked about the big picture goals, inclusion, preventing harm, and non-discrimination. But how do those actually play out when we're trying to decide who gets to compete?
That's where those next few principles come in.
Yeah.
Right, starting with principle 4, which I think gets to the heart of so much of the debate. Fairness. What does the IOC actually say about that?
Well, they acknowledge that sometimes in sex-segregated competition, ag youths might need to set eligibility criteria to make sure there's a fair and proportionate distribution of advantages. They're not saying restrictions are never okay, but they're setting a really high bar.
So they're saying we can't just assume someone has an unfair advantage because they're transgender or have sex variations.
Right. It goes back to that evidence-based approach. Principle 5 explicitly states there's no presumption of advantage. You have to actually prove that the advantage exists, that it's consistent, that it's disproportionate, and that it's relevant to the specific sport we're talking about.
I'm thinking about all the factors that can give athletes an edge, like height in basketball or flexibility in gymnastics. Those are advantages, but we don't consider them unfair.
Right, exactly. And the framework is basically saying, hey, some level of advantage is inherent in elite sports. The question is, when does an advantage become so significant that it undermines the integrity of the competition?
And how do you measure that? It seems pretty
See,
subjective.
that's where Principle 6 comes in, that robust, peer-reviewed research we keep talking about. The IOC is saying you can't rely on assumptions or stereotypes. You need hard data, data that shows a consistent and disproportionate advantage that's specific to that sport at that level of competition.
So if a study shows a certain advantage in, say, recreational runners, that doesn't automatically mean it applies to elite marathoners.
Right, and you also can't just extrapolate from data on cisgender men to make rules about transgender women. The research has to be directly relevant to the athlete group in question.
That makes sense. So it sounds like fairness is about more than just preventing any and all advantages. It's about ensuring a level playing field where those advantages are proportionate and don't totally skew the competition.
That's a great way to put it. And Principle 4 also acknowledges that sometimes physical characteristics can pose a safety risk in certain sports.
Like in combat sports, for example, where weight classes are so important.
Yes, but the framework is clear that you can't use gender identity or sex variations as a stand-in for actual risk assessment. If there is a legitimate safety concern, it should be addressed based on objective measures, like an individual's size and power, not on their identity.
So the solution should apply to everyone in that sport, regardless of who they are.
Exactly. It's about mitigating the actual risk, not making assumptions based on stereotypes.
Okay, so let's talk about Principle 7, primacy of health and bodily autonomy. That one feels especially important given the history of athletes being pressured to conform to certain standards.
It really is. This principle is all about protecting athletes from coercion and ensuring that their health and well-being are the top priority. No athlete should ever be pressured to undergo medically unnecessary procedures just to meet eligibility criteria.
So no one should be forced to alter their body just to compete.
Exactly. And they specifically call out those invasive physical exams that have been used in the past to try to determine an athlete's sex.
Which are not only unreliable, but incredibly invasive and potentially traumatic. It's great to see the IOC taking such a strong stance against those practices.
They're drawing a clear line. Eligibility criteria should never involve procedures that violate an athlete's bodily autonomy or put their health at risk.
And they also emphasize the importance of informed consent. Athletes need to understand the risks and benefits of any medical intervention and be able to make those decisions freely, without pressure.
This aligns perfectly with medical ethics when you say it's about respecting the fundamental right to bodily integrity.
Absolutely. Okay, on to Principle 8. This one calls for a stakeholder-centered approach, which I imagine means involving athletes in the process of developing these policies.
Yes, it's recognizing that these rules have a huge impact on people's lives. So those who are most affected need to have a seat at the table. Specifically, trans athletes and athletes with sex variations need to be part of the conversation.
That just makes sense. How can you create fair and effective policies if you're not listening to the people they're going to impact?
Right. And it's not just about listening. It's about ensuring that decisions about eligibility are made in a neutral and impartial way. Athletes need to have clear avenues to raise concerns or grievances, and there needs to be accountability if something goes wrong.
It's about creating a system where athletes feel heard, respected, and protected.
Exactly. Now, Principle 9 is all about the right to privacy, which feels particularly crucial when we're talking about such sensitive information.
The framework emphasizes the need to protect athletes' personal information, including medical data like testosterone levels, right?
That's right. They're saying this information should only be used for its intended purpose and shouldn't be disclosed without the athlete's consent.
So no outing athletes or sharing their medical records without their permission.
Exactly. They call for transparency in the decision-making process, but also emphasize the need to protect the privacy of individuals. It's a balancing act. But finding that balance is essential.
It's about protecting athletes from potential harm and ensuring they can participate in sports without fearing their privacy will be violated.
It's about creating a culture of respect and recognizing the dignity of all athletes.
And finally, we have Principle 10, which focuses on periodic reviews. This one seems pretty straightforward. It's about making sure these policies stay relevant and up to date.
You got it. The IOC is calling for regular reviews of eligibility criteria. to consider new scientific findings, legal precedents, ethical considerations, and feedback from stakeholders.
So it's not about setting the rules in stone and forgetting about them.
Not at all. This is a rapidly evolving area, and what might have been considered fair or appropriate a few years ago might need to be reconsidered in light of new evidence or changing social norms.
It's about being flexible, adaptable, and acknowledging that there's always more to learn.
Exactly. It's about building continuous improvement into the system and ensuring that policies remain dynamic and responsive to the needs of athletes and the evolving landscape of sport.
Wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. These 10 principles really are comprehensive. And they touch on so many important aspects of fairness, inclusion, and athlete well-being.
They do, and they provide a valuable framework for navigating the complexities of this issue.
But the real work starts now, right? Now it's up to the IFs to take these principles and translate them into actual policies for their specific sports.
Exactly, and that's going to be a massive undertaking with a lot of tough decisions to be made.
It's going to require careful consideration, collaboration with experts, and ongoing engagement with athletes.
And let's not forget that this is an ongoing conversation. New research is emerging all the time. Social norms are shifting.
Yeah.
And we need to be prepared to adapt and adjust these policies as needed.
This is definitely not a set it and forget it situation.
Nope. This is a dynamic and complex issue that's going to require ongoing attention, reflection, and a willingness to evolve.
We're really at a pivotal moment in the history of competitive sports.
I agree. And I think this framework has the potential to create a more welcoming, inclusive, and equitable sporting landscape for all athletes.
A sporting landscape where everyone has the opportunity to compete at their highest level, free from discrimination and with their health and dignity fully respected.
That's a vision worth fighting for.
Well said. All right, listeners, we've covered a lot in this deep dive, but there's still so much more to explore. When we come back, we'll talk about the potential implications of this framework for the future of competitive sports and what it means for all of us involved. Stay tuned. All right, we're back, ready to wrap up this deep dive into the IOC's framework on fairness, inclusion, and non-discrimination. We've covered a lot, from the 10 core principles to real-world examples like the Australian Football League.
Yeah, it's been fascinating exploring these ideas and thinking about what they mean for the future of sports.
So let's talk about those implications. You mentioned earlier that this framework is a potential game changer. What are some of the biggest shifts you think we might see in the coming years?
Well, for one, I think we're going to see a much more nuanced and individualized approach to eligibility. The days of those blanket restrictions based on a single factor, like testosterone levels, are probably numbered.
So instead of saying all transgender women are ineligible or all athletes with a certain condition can't compete, we're going to see policies that look at the whole athlete and consider a wider range of factors.
Exactly. And those factors might vary depending on the sport. What matters for fairness in a powerlifting competition might be totally different from what matters in a marathon, for example.
This means we're going to see a lot more variation in policies across different sports.
Yeah.
Some might lean towards more restrictive criteria, while others might prioritize inclusion.
That's right. And this is going to require a lot of careful thought and analysis from IFs. They're going to need to really understand the specific demands of their sport and consider the available research on transgender athletes and athletes with sex variations in their discipline.
It's going to be interesting to see how this all plays out. I'm particularly curious about the impact this is going to have on athletes themselves, especially transgender athletes and athletes with sex variations who have historically faced so many barriers to participation.
I think this framework has the potential to be incredibly empowering for these athletes. The emphasis on evidence-based decision-making, the protection of bodily autonomy, and the call for a stakeholder-centered approach. These are all huge steps in the right direction.
It feels like the IOC is finally acknowledging the unique needs and experiences of these athletes and saying, hey, you deserve to be here. And we're going to work to create a system that's fair and inclusive for everyone.
Exactly. But we can't get complacent. This framework is just the starting point. It's a roadmap, not a destination.
What do you mean?
Well, the real work starts now. IFs need to take these principles and translate them into concrete policies. And that's where the rubber meets the road.
It's going to be a messy process, I imagine. There's bound to be disagreement and debate as different stakeholders try to figure out what works best.
Absolutely. And it's going to require a lot of collaboration and open-mindedness. We're going to need experts from a variety of fields: sports scientists, medical professionals, ethicists, lawyers, and of course, athletes themselves, all working together to find solutions that are both fair and workable.
This seems like a pivotal moment for sports medicine professionals in particular.
It really is. We have a responsibility to stay informed about these issues, to provide evidence-based guidance, and to advocate for the health and well-being of all athletes.
We need to be leaders in this conversation,
Right.
helping to shape policies that are grounded in science, ethics, and compassion.
And we need to be prepared to have tough conversations, to challenge assumptions, and to push for change when it's needed.
It's a big responsibility, but it's also an exciting opportunity to be part of something truly transformative.
I agree. We have a chance to help create a sporting landscape that's truly inclusive and equitable for all.
And that's a goal worth striving for.
It absolutely is.
Well, listeners, we've reached the end of our deep dive. But I hope this conversation has just sparked the beginning of your own exploration of these complex and important issues.
Keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep pushing for a better, more inclusive future for competitive sports.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.